Name the man who built the United States Army in World War II, not the man who commanded it in the field, not the man who planned the campaigns or took the surrender. The man who took a peacetime force smaller than Portugal's, an army that ranked 17th in the world, that trained with broomsticks instead of rifles and trucks labeled tank instead of actual armor, and turned it into the largest, most lethal ground-fighting force on the planet. The man George Marshall called the brains of the Army, the man who personally designed the training system that processed over 8 million soldiers across 91 divisions, a system so effective that its basic structure remains the foundation of how the United States prepares for war 80 years later. You cannot name him. Almost nobody can. He has no Hollywood movie, no best-selling biography until 2015, no statue in any major city. His face appears in no documentary you have watched. His name was Lieutenant General Leslie James McNair. He was the highest-ranking American killed in the European theater. He was 61 years old, and he was not killed by the Germans. He was killed by American bombs, dropped from American B-17 heavy bombers, during an operation planned by Omar Bradley and executed by the 8th Air Force. His body was so badly destroyed that the only way anyone could identify him was by the 3 stars on his collar. Troops found his West Point class ring in the dirt nearby. That was all that was left. And then the Army lied about it. The War Department told the American public he had been killed by enemy fire. That was false, and they knew it was false when they said it. They had to lie, because even McNair's corpse was classified. His death, if revealed, would have unraveled one of the most important deception operations of the entire war. And then, 12 days later, his only son was killed in the Pacific. This is the story of the most important American general you have never heard of, and of the system that erased him from memory 3 times over. Once by keeping him in the shadows during his career, once by concealing the truth of his death, and once by forgetting him entirely after the war ended. To understand who Leslie McNair was, you have to understand what the United States Army looked like before he got to work. In 1939, the active duty strength of the United States Army stood at roughly 174,000 soldiers. That number ranked America somewhere around 17th or 19th in the world, depending on the source. Comparable to Romania, smaller than the Netherlands. Divisions existed mostly on paper, equipped with World War I leftovers, training with broomsticks in place of rifles and trucks labeled tank for exercises. McNair was born on May 25, 1883, in Verndale, Minnesota, a small farming community in the central part of the state. His father was a merchant. Nothing about his origins suggested military greatness. He entered West Point and graduated 11th out of 124 cadets in the class of 1904, alongside men like Joseph Stilwell, who would later command the China-Burma-India Theater. McNair was commissioned as a 2nd lieutenant of artillery, and from the beginning, his career split between 2 instincts that should have been contradictory but somehow coexisted in one man. The first instinct was technical brilliance of the highest order. At the Sandy Hook Proving Ground, and later the Watertown Arsenal, he earned 3 patents for artillery projectile designs. He was not simply an officer who understood artillery. He was an engineer who could design the ordnance itself. He spent 7 months in France in 1913 observing French artillery methods and returned with innovations that would shape American gunnery training for a generation. The second instinct was a compulsion to be where the bullets were. He served in the Veracruz expedition in 1914, wading ashore with troops under fire. He served with Pershing in the punitive expedition against Pancho Villa in 1916, crossing the Mexican desert in pursuit of an enemy that refused to stand and fight. He was not a desk officer who dabbled in field work. He was a field officer who happened to be brilliant at systems. That combination made him unusual. It also made him dangerous to himself. World War I made his reputation. Promoted to major in May 1917, he shipped to France aboard the same vessel as a young captain named George Marshall. That voyage forged a bond that would reshape the American military a quarter century later. In France, McNair served as Chief of Artillery Training and Tactics for the American Expeditionary Force, earning the Distinguished Service Medal for what the citation described as being largely responsible for impressing upon the American Army sound principles for the use of artillery. The French government awarded him the Legion of Honor. By October 1918, he held the temporary rank of Brigadier General at the age of 35, making him the 2nd youngest general officer in the Army. Then the war ended, and he was reduced back to major. That is the peacetime Army. The system gives you a star and then takes it back. If you're finding this valuable, subscribing genuinely helps. It tells the algorithm this kind of deep research is worth showing to more people. Now, back to McNair. The interwar years were not glamorous. They never are. The Army shrank, budgets evaporated, and officers waited decades for promotions that never came. McNair was reduced from Brigadier General back to his permanent rank of Major, and he would not reach Brigadier General again permanently until 1937, nearly 20 years later. But he used every one of those years. He helped reform the Command and General Staff Course at Fort Leavenworth, which trained the mid-career officers who who would lead battalions and regiments in the next war. He co-authored the 1923 Field Service Regulations, the doctrinal Bible of the interwar Army. He served at the Army War College. He tested the triangular division reorganization with the 2nd Infantry Division from 1937 to 1939, working out the practical problems of a smaller, more mobile formation in field exercises that most of the Army ignored. None of this generates headlines. None of this earns you a chapter in a popular history book. But all of it was building something. McNair was assembling the intellectual toolkit he would need when the next war came, and unlike most of his contemporaries, he never doubted that it was coming. In July 1940, Marshall, now Army Chief of Staff, installed McNair as Chief of Staff of the new General Headquarters. And in March 1942, when the War Department reorganized into 3 commands, Army Ground Forces, Army Air Forces, and Army Service Forces, Marshall gave McNair the assignment that would define his legacy and destroy his reputation simultaneously: Commanding General, Army Ground Forces, responsible for organizing, training, equipping, and deploying every ground combat soldier in the United States Army. Let me say that again. Every ground combat soldier, every infantryman, every tanker, every artilleryman, every paratrooper, every ranger. All of them went through McNair's system before they went to war. The scale of what McNair built is staggering, and I think most people do not fully appreciate it. He took that army of 174,000 and helped grow it to over 8 million. Army Ground Forces at its peak in mid-1943 directly controlled 2.2 million troops across dozens of training installations. This was the largest military training organization ever established in American history. McNair designed a progressive training system that moved recruits through a deliberate sequence. Individual soldier tasks first, marksmanship, navigation, first aid, then small unit exercises at the squad and platoon level, then battalion and regimental maneuvers, then 4 weeks of division level training, then massive combined arms exercises at corps and army scale. His insistence on realism was not a preference, it was a doctrine. He instituted live fire battle inoculations, where soldiers trained under actual machine gun fire and live artillery to acclimate them to the sounds and chaos of real combat. Exercises were unscripted. Umpires adjudicated outcomes. Commanders were expected to exercise initiative, not follow a script. The men who could not adapt were identified and removed before they got soldiers killed overseas. The crown jewel of this system was the Louisiana Maneuvers of 1941, the largest peacetime training exercises ever conducted by the United States Army. Approximately 400,000 to 470,000 troops in 19 divisions, maneuvering across 3,400 square miles of Louisiana and East Texas in the brutal summer heat. 2 fictitious armies going head-to-head in unscripted exercises that lasted weeks. The terrain was swamps, pine forests, and red clay roads that turned to mud in the rain. Soldiers slept in foxholes, ate field rations, and marched until their boots fell apart. McNair selected the terrain personally because it was miserable. That was the point. He directed the training, and he observed from every vantage point he could reach, often driving his own jeep forward into the mock combat zones, scribbling notes on a clipboard. He was looking for 2 things. First, which units could adapt and which could not. Second, which commanders had the instinct for battle and which were merely going through the motions. Marshall used the maneuvers to evaluate senior leadership with ruthless efficiency. The results were devastating for the old guard. Marshall relieved 31 of 42 senior commanders to make way for younger, more aggressive officers. Generals who had held their positions for decades were removed in a single exercise cycle. The exercises identified rising stars, including Patton, who commanded an armored force with characteristic aggression, and Eisenhower, who distinguished himself as a planner on Kruger's staff. They tested armored and anti-tank doctrine. They exposed critical failures in logistics and communications and small unit leadership. The maneuvers proved, among many other things, that the Army's logistical system could not support mechanized warfare over extended distances, a finding that would have consequences from North Africa to the Ardennes. Subsequent maneuvers in the Carolinas in November 1941 and additional Louisiana exercises in 1942 and 43 refined the system further. Here is the part that most histories skip. McNair did not just train soldiers. He decided how the Army would be structured, and several of those decisions remain among the most debated in American military history. The triangular division was his signature. He replaced the bloated World War I square division of 4 regiments and roughly 28,000 men with a leaner formation of 3 regiments and approximately 14,253 soldiers. Specialized assets, tanks, tank destroyers, anti-aircraft artillery were pooled at corps and Army level and attached to divisions as needed rather than assigned permanently. McNair was, in the words of one military historian, a consistent and positive brake upon expensive, overmanned, and specialized divisions. The idea was sound in theory. In practice, divisions were chronically short of support, and the constant shuffling of attached units degraded the teamwork that keeps soldiers alive. The tank destroyer doctrine was McNair's most controversial legacy. He championed dedicated tank destroyer battalions, fast, lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns, as the primary counter to enemy armor. At peak strength, the Tank Destroyer Center numbered over 100,000 men and 80 battalions. In combat, the doctrine largely failed. Tank destroyer units were invariably broken into platoons to support infantry, firing 11 rounds of high explosive for every single round of armor piercing. They functioned as mobile artillery, not tank killers. General Jacob Devers declared bluntly that the tank destroyer concept was not practical on the battlefield, and that the weapon to beat a tank was another tank. I believe McNair's tank destroyer doctrine was his biggest mistake. Not because the idea was stupid, it was not. It was a reasonable response to the German blitzkrieg tactics that had terrified military planners in 1940 and 41, but McNair refused to adapt when combat experience proved him wrong, and that rigidity cost lives. He also resisted fielding the M26 Pershing heavy tank, citing weight and shipping constraints, which left American armored forces fighting Panthers and Tigers with Shermans whose 75mm guns could not penetrate German frontal armor at normal combat ranges. Historian Stephen Zalaga has argued this reflected a World War I mindset. McNair's biographer, Mark Calhoun, counters that his decisions must be understood within production constraints and the competing demands of global logistics. I think the truth is somewhere in between. McNair was right that the Army could not have everything it wanted. He was wrong about which compromises were acceptable. The 90 Division gamble was another consequence of McNair's force structure philosophy, and one that nearly cost the Allies the war in the winter of 1944. Before Pearl Harbor, Army planners envisioned fielding as many as 334 divisions. The Army ultimately activated only 89, 66 infantry, 16 armored, 5 airborne, 1 cavalry, and 1 mountain. Competing demands from the Navy at roughly 4 million personnel, the Army Air Forces at about 2 million, the war industry that produced the weapons and vehicles and ammunition, and the Army Service Forces that shipped everything overseas made a larger ground force impossible. Every man in a rifle company was a man not building a bomber or loading a Liberty ship. The consequence was severe and nearly fatal. By late 1944, American commanders had virtually no strategic reserves. When the Germans launched their Ardennes offensive in December, Eisenhower had to strip other sectors bare and rush airborne divisions from rest areas to plug the gap. Exhausted divisions that had been in continuous combat since June remained in the line because there was no one to relieve them. The 84th Infantry Division went from its first day of combat on November 18th, 1944, to VE Day without a single day out of the line. That is the 90 Division gamble in human terms. And there was a problem McNair fought but could not fix. A problem that haunted the American infantry from North Africa to the Elbe. The men allocated to ground combat forces scored systematically lower on Army classification tests than those sent to the Air Forces, the Service Forces, the Navy, and the Marines. The smartest recruits, the men who scored highest on the Army General Classification Test, went everywhere except the infantry. The Air Forces took the top tier, the Navy took the next. The technical branches and the Service Forces skimmed what remained. By the time the ground combat arms received their allocation, they were drawing from the bottom of the manpower pool. The average AGCT score for infantry replacements was significantly below the Army-wide average. McNair knew this. He protested it repeatedly. He fought the Army Specialized Training Program, which pulled 150,000 high-scoring men out of combat units and sent them to college campuses for engineering and language courses. He argued, correctly, that sending the Army's best minds to classrooms while the infantry got the remainder was a formula for unnecessary casualties. He was overruled. The program continued until early 1944, when the manpower crisis finally forced its cancellation, and those college soldiers were sent back to infantry divisions, many of them arriving just in time for the Normandy campaign. The infantry got what was left, and the men who did the hardest fighting in the most dangerous conditions were, as a group, the least prepared by education and aptitude to do it. That is not a failure of the soldiers. It is a failure of the system that allocated them. What happened next should have ended careers, but it did not, because nobody wanted to admit that the system was broken. Here is where the story turns darker. And here is where you begin to see the pattern that would kill him. McNair had a habit that was extraordinary and reckless for an officer of his rank. He personally visited frontline troops in active combat zones. Not occasionally, not as a ceremonial gesture. Constantly, compulsively, as a matter of professional conviction. He believed a training commander had a duty to see combat conditions with his own eyes so that he could adjust the training program to match reality. Other generals visited the front for morale purposes. McNair visited the front for data. He wanted to know whether the tactics he had taught actually worked when the bullets were real. He wanted to see whether the equipment he had authorized was adequate, whether the doctrine he had written held up under pressure, whether the leaders he had certified could actually lead. Nobody outranked him in the Army ground forces. Nobody could order him to stay back, and nobody could talk him out of going forward. Marshall knew about the trips and tolerated them. Eisenhower later expressed frustration that a general of McNair's importance was repeatedly putting himself in harm's way. But McNair went anyway. His inspection tours took him to North Africa, where he observed the fighting in Tunisia during the spring of 1943. The American Army was still learning, and learning painfully. Kasserine Pass had been a humiliation just 2 months earlier. McNair wanted to see for himself whether the replacements and the revised training were making a difference. On April 23, 1943, during that inspection tour, McNair pushed as far forward as possible to observe American troops in direct contact with the enemy. He was closer to the German lines than any three-star general had any reason to be. An artillery or mortar burst struck near his position. A company first sergeant standing nearby was killed instantly. McNair took fragmentation wounds to his arm and head. A fragment pierced his steel helmet. He received the Purple Heart and was evacuated for treatment. The official reports described the wounds as not serious. This was technically true in the sense that he survived them. But the explosion aggravated a condition McNair had fought to conceal throughout the war. Progressive hearing loss that had rendered him effectively deaf. The deafness predated Tunisia and had worsened steadily over years. McNair had learned to read lips with remarkable skill. He avoided large meetings where multiple people spoke at once. He relied heavily on written communication and one-on-one conversations where he could watch the speaker's face. Marshall knew about the disability. He let McNair continue serving because McNair was irreplaceable and because the deafness did not impair his ability to train armies. But the deafness was one reason McNair never received a traditional field command. You cannot command a division in combat if you cannot hear the battle. You cannot coordinate an attack if you cannot hear the radio. McNair knew this. He accepted it, and he compensated for it by going forward in person, getting closer to the action than his ears could no longer bring to him. He returned to duty within weeks, still deaf, still determined to go forward. The Army promoted no one to replace him. There was no one who could do what he did. In the summer of 1944, McNair relinquished Army Ground Forces Command to Lieutenant General Ben Lear and traveled to France under orders from Eisenhower and Marshall. He arrived on July 23, 1944, 2 days before his death. His official assignment was to replace George Patton as the nominal commander of the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, known as FUSAG, the centerpiece of the Operation Fortitude deception that convinced the Germans the main Allied invasion would strike at the Pas de Calais rather than Normandy. Patton had been FUSAG's phantom commander, but now Patton was needed in the real war. He was about to take command of Third Army and lead the breakout exploitation. Someone of equivalent rank and stature had to take his place on the German intelligence maps. McNair, a three-star general with no field command and a name the Germans would recognize, was the logical choice. But McNair, characteristically, did not intend to sit in a headquarters pretending to command imaginary troops. He also intended to observe real troops in real combat. He wanted to see how his training had held up after 7 weeks of the most brutal hedgerow fighting in American military history. He wanted data, and so he went forward. Again, for the last time. Operation Cobra was General Omar Bradley's plan to break the grinding Normandy stalemate. And to understand why it mattered so much, you have to understand how desperate the situation had become. After 7 weeks of hedgerow fighting that had cost over 100,000 Allied casualties for negligible territorial gains, the Allied armies were trapped in a narrow beachhead barely 30 miles deep. The bocage country of Normandy, with its ancient hedgerows growing on earthen embankments sometimes 6 feet high, had turned every field into a fortress and every road into an ambush corridor. Divisions were being chewed apart at a rate that exceeded the replacement system's ability to fill the gaps. Infantry companies that had landed on D-Day with 180 men were down to 60 or 70. Morale was cracking. The press was beginning to ask uncomfortable questions. Montgomery's repeated failures to take Caen in the British sector had put additional pressure on Bradley to produce results on the American side. Bradley designed a concentrated armored breakout preceded by the largest tactical aerial bombardment of the war. The concept was simple in theory and terrifying in execution. Saturate a narrow section of the German defensive line with so much high explosive that the defenders would be physically destroyed or so stunned they could not resist. Then send Major General J. Lawton Collins's 7th Corps racing through the gap before the Germans could recover. The target was a rectangular box along the Saint-Lô to Perrier Road, approximately 7,000 yards wide and 2,500 yards deep. The air armadas assembled for Cobra was staggering in its scale. Approximately 1,500 to 1,800 heavy bombers, B-17s and B-24s of the 8th Air Force, 380 medium bombers, B-26 Marauders of the 9th Air Force, 350 to 600 fighter bombers. Roughly 3,000 aircraft in total, delivering over 4,100 tons of high explosives, fragmentation bombs, and napalm. Nothing like this had ever been attempted in support of a ground attack. A fateful disagreement planted the seeds of catastrophe. Bradley insisted the bombers approach parallel to the Saint-Lô road, so that aiming errors would scatter bombs across German positions rather than onto American troops. The heavy bomber commanders, General Karl Spaatz and Lieutenant General Jimmy Doolittle, insisted on a perpendicular approach, arguing that Bradley's own demand for overwhelming shock effect required maximum bomber formations through the shortest axis of the target. Bradley later claimed he left the planning conference believing a parallel approach had been agreed. The airmen maintained they had explained clearly that a parallel run was impossible. This ambiguity was never resolved in writing. On July 24th, bad weather forced a recall, but 352 heavy bombers had already released approximately 685 tons of ordnance before receiving the cancellation order. The bombs came in perpendicular to the front, and they fell short. The 30th Infantry Division's 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment absorbed the worst. 25 Americans killed, 131 wounded. Men who had survived D-Day and 7 weeks of hedgerow fighting were torn apart by their own Air Force. Bradley was furious. He had also discovered that the bombs were far heavier than the 100-pound fragmentation types he had specifically requested. The Air Force had dropped 500-pound and 1,000-pound general-purpose bombs, creating massive craters that would slow his own armor rather than the anti-personnel effect he had wanted. Despite the disaster, despite the fact that his own soldiers had been bombed by his own aircraft, despite knowing the approach direction was perpendicular rather than parallel, Bradley authorized a repeat for July 25. The perpendicular approach could not be changed given the time and force constraints. The safety zone between the bomb line and the forward American positions was 1,200 yards. Bradley had originally wanted 800. The Air Force had recommended 3,000. They compromised on 1,200. For B-17s, bombing from 20,000 feet, that margin was a death sentence waiting to happen. At approximately 9:40 in the morning on July 25th, the bombardment commenced. Fighter bombers struck first, laying down smoke and fragmentation across the German positions. Then the vast armada of heavy bombers filled the sky from horizon to horizon. The sound alone was overwhelming. One soldier described it as the entire sky humming like a telephone wire. Wind blew smoke from the initial explosions northward, directly into American lines. The lead bombardiers could see the target clearly. The crews behind them could not. Subsequent bomber waves, their aim points obscured by the growing wall of dust and smoke, dropped progressively shorter. One group after another released early. Approximately 35 to 42 aircraft dropped their loads directly onto friendly positions. McNair was in a slit trench with the 2nd Battalion, 120th Infantry Regiment. The same unit that had been hit the previous day. The same men who had already buried their friends killed by American bombs 24 hours earlier. A bomb struck squarely on or beside his position. The explosion was so violent that it threw McNair's body 60 feet through the air and destroyed it so completely that identification was impossible by any normal means. Some accounts placed the distance at 80 feet. There was no face left to recognize. There were no dog tags left to read. The only thing that survived intact were the 3 stars on his collar. Troops searching the blast crater found his West Point-class ring in the churned earth nearby. That ring and those stars were all that remained of the man who had built the American army. He was 61 years old. He had survived World War I, the punitive expedition, a wounding in Tunisia, and decades of service. He was killed on a Tuesday morning in July by the Air Force of the country he had spent his life defending. War correspondent Ernie Pyle, the most famous journalist of the war, was with the adjacent 4th Infantry Division that morning. Pyle, who had seen combat across North Africa and Italy and who would himself be killed by a Japanese machine gun on Iwo Jima less than a year later, described the Cobra bombardment as the most sustained, horrible thing he had ever gone through. He watched the lines of exploding bombs moving back toward the American positions, flight by flight. Instead of advancing forward as the plan required, Pyle saw men around him pressed flat into the earth, praying, weeping, some unable to move even after the bombing ended. That was what it looked like from the adjacent sector. In the 120th Infantry sector, where McNair was, it was worse. The numbers tell the rest of the story. On July 24th, the short bombing killed 25 Americans and wounded 131. On July 25th, 111 were killed and 490 wounded, with an additional 164 combat fatigue cases in the 30th Division alone. The combined 2-day toll reached approximately 136 killed and more than 600 wounded. When you include missing and combat fatigue cases, the total approaches 900 casualties, American casualties, from American bombs. The 30th Infantry Division, Old Hickory, was devastated. On July 25th alone, the division suffered 64 killed, 374 wounded, 60 missing, and 164 combat fatigue cases, 662 total casualties in a single day from friendly fire. The 120th Infantry Regiment, hit on both days, was nearly shattered. The 957th Field Artillery Battalion lost 13 killed and 22 wounded. Elements of the 9th Infantry Division, the 39th and 47th Infantry Regiments, suffered additional killed and wounded. The 4th Infantry Division, in the adjacent sector, also took short drops. Besides McNair, the dead included George B. Irvin, an Associated Press photographer. Here is where the decision becomes indefensible. Not the decision to bomb, Not even the decision to use heavy bombers for tactical support. The decision to proceed on July 25th, after the short bombing on July 24th. Bradley knew the bombs had fallen on his own men. He knew the approach direction had been perpendicular, not parallel. He authorized it again anyway, with a 1,200-yard safety zone that was grossly inadequate for the bombing accuracy achievable by heavy bombers at 20,000 feet. No direct communication link existed between the bombers and the ground troops. The 8th Air Force's own post-strike analysis, with clinical detachment, rated the overall bombing as technically accurate with less bombing errors than anticipated. I think that sentence tells you everything you need to know about how the institution processed what happened. In my view, the responsibility was shared, and the institutional failure was deeper than any single decision. Bradley blamed the Air Force for what he called duplicity in his memoir, A Soldier's Story. The air commanders countered that a parallel approach was physically impossible, given Bradley's own operational requirements. Historian Brian Todd Carey concluded that the blame does not rest entirely on any one service. I agree. This was a systems failure. Air and ground forces operating with different assumptions, different vocabularies, different risk tolerances, and no written agreement on the most basic element of the plan: the direction the bombers would fly. And if that sounds familiar, if you have ever watched two departments in the same organization operate with completely different assumptions about a plan that was never properly documented, and then watch the people at the bottom pay the price for the confusion at the top, you are not imagining the parallel. It was true in 1944, and it is true now. Despite the carnage, Operation Cobra achieved its objective. The bombardment shattered the Panzer Lehr Division so thoroughly that its commander, General Fritz Bayerlein, reported that his forward positions had been annihilated, with at least 70% of his troops killed, wounded, missing, or left in a state of catatonic shock. Only a handful of tanks and assault guns survived intact. Collins's 7th Corps punched through the gap within hours, and by July 27, the breakout was unmistakable. Patton's Third Army poured through behind Collins, and within days the Normandy stalemate was over, and the race across France had begun. The campaign that had seemed on the verge of strategic failure turned into one of the most dramatic Allied victories of the war. The irony is almost too heavy to bear. The bombing that killed McNair also won the battle that broke Normandy open. The system that destroyed its own architect produced the result the architect had spent years preparing his soldiers to achieve. Eisenhower, shaken by the friendly fire toll, briefly vowed never to use heavy bombers for tactical ground support again, though he later relented for Operation Goodwood and the Rhine crossings. No one was disciplined. No formal investigation concluded with accountability. The official record absorbed this catastrophe and moved on. Now here is the part of McNair's story that moves from tragedy into something stranger, something that reveals how the system treats its people even after death. McNair's death triggered an immediate security crisis that went far beyond the usual concerns of wartime censorship. He was in France, not simply as an observer, but as the fictitious commander of FUSAG, the first United States Army group, the Phantom Army group that existed only in fake radio traffic, inflatable rubber tanks, dummy landing craft, double agents feeding false intelligence to the Abwehr, and elaborate set pieces designed to convince the German High Command that the Normandy landing was a feint. FUSAG supposedly comprised 11 non-existent divisions and approximately 150,000 imaginary soldiers arrayed in southeast England, poised to invade the Pas de Calais, the shortest crossing point of the English Channel. The deception was spectacularly effective, and its scale is often underappreciated. The German 15th Army, with more than 25 infantry divisions and 3 panzer divisions, remained frozen at Calais for nearly 2 months after D-Day. 25 divisions that could have been thrown against the beachhead at Normandy sat idle because Hitler and his generals were convinced that Eisenhower's main blow had not yet fallen. Hitler personally refused to release reserves for 7 weeks. Field Marshal Rommel begged for reinforcements. They were denied. The 15th Army waited for an invasion that existed only in the minds of German intelligence officers, sustained by fake radio chatter in the name of a single American general on a phantom order of battle. First, it was Patton. After Patton took command of Third Army and appeared in France, it became McNair. If the Germans learned McNair was dead in Normandy, they would realize FUSAG was fiction. They would realize Patton had been a decoy. They would realize the Pas de Calais invasion was never coming. And they would release those 25 divisions for the Normandy front. Eisenhower ordered the death kept secret. McNair received a funeral conducted under the strictest secrecy that a 3-star general's burial could allow. No band played, no rifle volleys fired, no flag-draped casket carried through public streets. The mourners were limited to Bradley, Patton, who served as pallbearer, Lieutenant General Courtney Hodges, Major General Elwood Quesada, Major General Ralph Royce, Major General William Keane, and McNair's aide-de-camp. A small group of generals standing in a French field, burying a man whose death they could not acknowledge, and whose life's work most of them had taken for granted. Patton, who had known McNair for decades and who would himself die from injuries in a vehicle accident just over a year later, wrote in his diary that McNair was a great friend and called it a sad ending and a useless sacrifice. It was the most honest thing any senior officer said about McNair's death. On July 27th, 2 days after the bombing, the War Department released a deliberately misleading two-sentence statement to the press. The War Department has been notified of the death of Lieutenant General Leslie J. McNair. General McNair was killed by enemy fire while observing the action of our front-line units in the recent offensive. That was a lie. He was killed by American fire, and every senior officer in the European theater knew it. The press was skeptical. The New York Times military analyst Hanson Baldwin called the initial statement a grave mistake. The Washington Post criticized the War Department for what it described as a familiar pattern of disingenuousness. Not until August 2nd, a full week after McNair's death, did the War Department correct the record, acknowledging that McNair had died from an American bomb during Operation Cobra. McNair was buried at the Normandy American Cemetery and Memorial at Colleville-sur-Mer, France. Plot F, Row 28, Grave 42. He remains the highest-ranking military officer interred there. After his death, Lieutenant General John DeWitt replaced him as the nominal FUSAG commander, and the deception continued until it was officially terminated on September 28, 1944. Even in death, McNair served the ruse. The tragedy compounded with devastating speed. Colonel Douglas Crevier McNair, the general's only son, served as Chief of Staff of the 77th Infantry Division, the Statue of Liberty Division, in the Pacific. Douglas had followed his father into West Point, graduating with the class of 1928, and had built a solid career in his own right. He was 37 years old, a full colonel, serving in one of the most demanding staff positions in the Pacific Theater. On August 6, 1944, exactly 12 days after his father's death on the other side of the world, Colonel McNair was killed on Guam. The 77th Division was in the process of clearing Japanese resistance from the island, and Douglas was forward, scouting a location for a new division command post. He encountered 3 Japanese soldiers in a native hut, approximately 300 yards from the main road. It was the kind of chance contact that killed men constantly in the Pacific, where the front line was everywhere and nowhere. Colonel McNair approached the hut, exchanged fire, and was struck and killed. He posthumously received the Silver Star, the Legion of Merit, and the Purple Heart. The 77th Division named its temporary encampment near Agate, Guam, Camp McNair in his honor. Miss Claire McNair, the general's wife, learned of her son's death less than 2 weeks after learning of her husband's. Father and son, killed in separate theaters, on separate islands, fighting separate enemies, less than 2 weeks apart. In her grief, Claire McNair reportedly destroyed the general's personal papers, his letters, his diaries, his private correspondence, the raw material from which any biography would have to be built. She could not know that by burning those papers, she was ensuring that her husband's story would be nearly impossible to tell for the next 7 decades. So why has no one heard of Leslie McNair? This is the question at the center of this video, and I think the answer is more interesting than the question itself, because it is not just about one forgotten general. It is about how the system decides who gets remembered. I think the answer involves 4 layers of erasure, each reinforcing the others, creating a silence so complete that even dedicated World War II historians often cannot name him. The first layer is the secrecy surrounding his death. The embarrassing truth that the Army's most senior training officer was killed by his own Army's bombs served no one's narrative in 1944. Not the Army's, not the Army Air Force's, not Bradley's. The initial cover-up was about protecting FUSAG, and that was a legitimate military necessity. But the institutional reluctance to discuss what actually happened lasted far longer than the deception required. Nobody wanted to explain how a 3-star general ended up in a foxhole that was being bombed by his own side. Nobody wanted to answer questions about why the bombing proceeded on July 25th after the catastrophe on July 24th. The easiest thing to do with McNair's death was to stop talking about it, and that is exactly what happened. The second layer is the nature of his job. McNair never commanded troops in battle during World War II. He worked in the unglamorous but absolutely essential role of organizer, trainer, and force designer. He built the machine, other men drove it. And the men who drive the machine are the ones who get the monuments and the memoirs and the movie roles. Eisenhower gets credit for coalition management. Patton gets credit for the dash across France. Bradley gets credit, fairly or not, for being the GI's general. McNair gets nothing, because his contribution was invisible by design. His job was to produce soldiers who were ready to fight. When they fought well, their theater commanders got the credit. When they fought poorly, McNair got the blame. That is the structural trap of being a trainer in any organization. You do your best work before the main event, and nobody remembers the preparation. They only remember the performance. The third layer is the absence of a personal record. McNair left no memoirs. He was dead before he could write any. His wife destroyed his personal papers. His deafness, concealed throughout the war, meant he operated in relative social isolation even among his peers. He could not participate easily in the conversations, the dinners, the informal relationships that shape how senior officers remember each other. He was present, but apart. Not until 2015 did McNair receive a full biography, when Mark Calhoun published General Leslie J. McNair, Unsung Architect of the U.S. Army, through the University Press of Kansas. Calhoun, a retired Army lieutenant colonel and senior historian at the National World War II Museum, had to overcome the absence of personal papers by discovering McNair's complete personnel file, previously thought destroyed in the 1973 National Archives fire. Rick Atkinson, whose Liberation trilogy is the definitive narrative history of the American war in Europe, praised the work, saying that McNair finally has the biographer he deserves. The fourth layer is the most revealing, and the one that connects McNair's story to the larger pattern this channel exists to expose. McNair's legacy is complicated. The tank destroyer doctrine failed. The opposition to heavy tanks left American crews outgunned. The lean division structure left infantry units chronically short of support. These are legitimate criticisms, and I have made them in this video. But the system that benefited from McNair's work, the system that used his training methods to produce the soldiers who won the war in Europe and the Pacific simultaneously, had no interest in elevating a figure whose record invited those hard questions. It is easier to celebrate Patton's dash across France than to examine whether the men in his tanks had adequate armor. It is easier to remember Eisenhower's strategic vision than to ask why the infantry that fought under him was systematically given the lowest quality manpower in the entire military establishment. It is easier to praise the soldier than to credit the man who taught him how to soldier. The Army needed McNair's work. It did not need his memory, and so it let him disappear. I think McNair deserves better than obscurity, not because he was flawless. He was not. The tank destroyer doctrine was wrong. His resistance to the Pershing heavy tank was wrong. His opposition to heavier divisions may have cost lives when the fighting in Normandy and the Ardennes demanded more organic firepower than his lean formations could provide. These are fair criticisms, and they matter, but they do not erase what he accomplished. The man took an army that ranked below Romania and built it into a force that conquered 2 continents simultaneously. He trained the soldiers who landed at Normandy, who fought through the hedgerows, who crossed the Rhine, who liberated the concentration camps, who island hopped across the Pacific. Every division that went overseas passed through his training system. Every soldier who knew how to dig a foxhole, clear a room, call for fire, or advance under contact learned those skills in a program McNair designed. According to Mark Calhoun, the military historian Peter Schifferle described McNair as a general officer, arguably second in importance only to George Marshall himself in building the wartime army. That assessment, in my view, is correct, and I think the fact that it would surprise most viewers of this channel tells you everything about how history selects its heroes. Marshall himself provided what may be the most fitting epitaph. He said that the astonishing successes of the armies McNair organized and trained constitute the only praise that he desired. That is a beautiful sentence. It is also a convenient one for an institution that preferred not to discuss how McNair died. Fort Leslie J. McNair in Washington, D.C., the installation where he headquartered Army ground forces during the war, choosing it over the newly completed Pentagon because he preferred to be closer to his troops, was renamed in his honor in 1948. It is one of the oldest continuously operating Army posts in the country, dating back to 1791. Today it houses the National Defense University, the Army Center of Military History, and the official residence of the Vice Chief of Staff. During the Cold War, McNair Barracks in Berlin and McNair Kaserne in Frankfurt also carried his name. Congress posthumously promoted him to the rank of full 4-star general in 1954. But most of the people who work at Fort McNair today do not know who it is named for. Most of the soldiers who pass through the Army's training system today do not know who built it. Let me give you the final numbers, because the numbers are the thing McNair himself would have wanted you to hear. He built a training system that processed over 8 million soldiers. He oversaw the activation of 91 divisions. The Louisiana maneuvers alone involved 470,000 troops across 3,400 square miles. He traveled to active combat zones despite being a 3-star general and being effectively deaf, because he believed he owed it to the men he had trained to see what they actually faced. He was wounded in Tunisia in April 1943. He was killed in Normandy on July 25, 1944. His body was identified by 3 stars on a collar. His death was concealed to protect a phantom army of inflatable tanks and fake radio signals. His son died 12 days later on the other side of the world. His wife destroyed his papers, and the army that he built forgot the man who built it. The man who created the machine was chewed up by it. The man who trained 8 million soldiers was killed by the bombs of his own air force, buried in secret, mourned in silence, lied about to the press, and written out of the story that he made possible. If your father or grandfather served in the Army during World War II, there's a very good chance Leslie McNair is the reason they knew how to fight. Those stories matter. If you have one, drop it in the comments. I think it is time we remembered his name. That is the story. The sources are in the description. I will see you in the next one.